The world remembers kings, conquerors, and empires, but heaven remembers men and women who walked by faith. After the apostles of the Lamb, God never stopped raising witnesses. They preached when it was illegal. They believed when it was dangerous. They endured when it cost them everything. This is heroes of faith, the true stories of believers whose lives proved that God is real. His power is timeless, and faith still changes the world. Kindly like, share, and subscribe, and let their faith strengthen you.
The screaming would not stop. It had started as a low murmur, a restlessness moving through the pews like wind through dry wheat, but within minutes it had broken into something that no church in colonial America had ever witnessed. Grown men clutched the wooden benches with both hands, their knuckles white, their faces drained of color, as though the floor itself had become a trapdoor over a furnace. Women wept uncontrollably. Young men who had strolled into that building barely an hour earlier with the casual arrogance of those who believed themselves untouchable were now crying out loud, their voices cracking with a terror that no human being could manufacture. Some grabbed their neighbors. Some fell from their seats. One report said the sound that rose from that congregation was like the groaning of a people who had looked over the edge of eternity and seen that it was real. And at the front of it all stood a thin, pale man in a black coat. He wore thick spectacles. He barely moved his hands. His voice was not loud. He was simply reading, steadily, almost methodically, from a manuscript he held close to his face. He had no dramatic gesture. He performed no theatrical display. He was, by every outward measure, the least likely person to have ignited what the world would come to know as the most spiritually explosive moment in the history of the American colonies. His name was Johnathan Edwards. He was 37 years old. And in that moment, on the morning of July 8, 1741, in a meeting house in Enfield, Connecticut, God was using one quiet, bookish, chronically ill Puritan pastor to split open the hardened ground of a generation's heart and plant eternity inside it. This is his story. Johnathan Edwards did not arrive in the world under easy circumstances. He was born on October 5, 1703, in East Windsor, Connecticut, the only son among 11 children born to the Reverend Timothy Edwards and his wife, Esther Stoddard Edwards. 4 sisters came before him. 6 more followed. He grew up surrounded by women, saturated in scripture, and shadowed always by the awareness that death was never very far away. The world into which Johnathan was born was not the romanticized version of colonial New England that appears in paintings and tourist brochures. It was a frontier, raw, dangerous, and soaked in grief. Less than a century had passed since the Pilgrims first set foot in Plymouth, and nearly half of those original settlers had died in their first winter. The settlements stretching between Northampton and Deerfield looked less like quiet villages and more like military garrisons, watchtowers, stockades, and the constant, low hum of fear. Queen Anne's War was raging. The French held territory to the north in Canada, and they had forged deep alliances with the Native American tribes. To the Puritans, this was not merely a political conflict. The French brought Roman Catholicism, and in the Puritan mind, Roman Catholicism was nothing less than the religion of the Antichrist. The stakes of every skirmish, every raid, every ambush felt cosmically enormous. The same week Johnathan was born, 2 men were ambushed by Indians just 50 miles north in the town of Deerfield. And then, on the bitter morning of February 29, 1704, Johnathan was still only a few months old. Roughly 200 Native American warriors and a small contingent of Frenchmen descended on Deerfield before dawn. 56 residents were killed. Another 100 were dragged northward into captivity. Among the dead were Jonathan's own relatives. His uncle John Williams, the pastor of Deerfield, watched in helpless horror as 2 of his children, a 6-week-old infant and a 6-year-old, were murdered before his eyes. His wife, Eunice, still weakened from recently giving birth, collapsed in a frozen stream and was killed on the spot with a single blow from a tomahawk. Another of Jonathan's uncles, John Stoddard, escaped wearing only a sleeping gown. He tore strips from his coat, wrapped his bleeding feet, and walked 10 miles through 2 feet of snow to summon help that arrived too late. This was the world in which Johnathan Edwards learned to pray. He later recorded being called to his knees several times a day as a child, crying out to God for the protection of family members still alive. Prayer was not a discipline for him. It was a lifeline, and it was woven into him before he was old enough to understand theology. His father Timothy was both his pastor and his schoolmaster, a common arrangement in those days, and from the earliest age, Johnathan was immersed in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. He was a sensitive, observant child with an extraordinary mind. He wandered through the fields and forests surrounding his home with a hunger that could not be satisfied by books alone. He felt something in the created world, a presence, a glory, something vast and beautiful pressing through the veil of the visible. He once wrote that he could sense the majesty of God in everything around him. Even as a boy, that spiritual hunger was deep and real. He recorded in his journals how he gathered other boys his age, and together they built a place in the woods where they could pray, and they went there as often as 5 times a day. 5 times a day. A group of young boys in colonial Connecticut, building prayer houses in the forest and seeking God together. There was something in Johnathan Edwards that, from childhood, simply could not be satisfied with anything less than God himself. But the hunger came and went. The warmth he felt as a boy cooled as he grew older. He entered the Collegiate School of Connecticut, which would later become Yale University, at the age of 13, and for a season his pursuit of God was crowded out by his pursuit of knowledge. He devoured books. He studied Newton and Locke. He was brilliant, restless, insatiably curious. He graduated at the head of his class in 1720 at the age of 16 and remained for 2 more years to pursue a master's degree. Then, in his senior year, something happened that cracked him open. He became gravely ill with pleurisy, a fierce and painful inflammation around the lungs. He lay in his sickbed, struggling to breathe, and for the first time as a young man he stared directly into the face of eternity. He described the feeling as being shook over the pit of hell. He was terrified, not merely of dying, but of dying unprepared, of stepping into eternity with a soul that had never truly settled its account with God. He consecrated himself afresh in that sickbed. He made promises. He cried out. He believed. And then he recovered and drifted again. This pattern, hunger and coldness, fire and frost, revival and retreat, followed Johnathan through his early years with a relentlessness that must have tormented him. His father's theology did not make it easier. Timothy Edwards taught that there were 3 specific steps to genuine conversion, and he was exceedingly strict in his assessment of who had truly experienced them. Of 30 people who came to him seeking confirmation of their conversion after a particular stirring of the Spirit, he accepted only 13. 13. Johnathan watched this and wondered whether his own experiences, so marked by uncertainty and struggle, meant that God had simply not elected him. The thought was almost unbearable for a young man whose entire inner life was oriented toward the divine. But something in Johnathan Edwards refused to quit. He could not settle for a God he only knew about. He had to know God personally. He pressed through the doubt, through the spiritual dryness, through the doctrinal anxieties. He pressed through until, in 1721, in an ordinary moment of study, a single verse of Scripture broke open the sky above him. He was reading from the first epistle to Timothy, "Now unto the King eternal, immortal, invisible, the only wise God, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen," when something happened in his soul that he had never experienced before. He wrote about it afterwards with a kind of trembling wonder. He said there came into his soul a sense of the glory of the divine being, a new sense, utterly unlike anything he had ever felt. Something diffused itself through him. He sat and thought about how excellent, how glorious, how perfect this God was, and then he wrote these words, "I thought with myself, how happy I should be, if I might enjoy that God, and be wrapped up to God in heaven, and be as it were swallowed up in him." Swallowed up in God. That phrase tells you everything you need to know about Johnathan Edwards. From that moment forward, it was not merely that he believed in God. He pursued God. With every faculty he possessed, His enormous intellect, his disciplined will, his emotional depth, his physical stamina however fragile, he pursued the knowledge and the presence and the glory of God with an obsessiveness that very few human beings in the history of the Church have ever matched. He wrote 70 personal resolutions, not casual intentions but iron commitments that he reviewed every week. He resolved never to waste a single moment of time. He resolved to live with all his might while he lived. He resolved to do what Christ would have him do if the last hour of his life had already come. He rose early because, he wrote, Christ rose from the grave very early, and that was reason enough. He recorded his failures and his progress with the same unflinching honesty. When he observed a gap between who he was and who he had resolved to be, he drafted another resolution to close it. He carried a pen and ink and small pieces of paper on his rides through the woods, where he did some of his deepest thinking and praying. When an idea came to him, he wrote it down and pinned it to his coat. His wife, Sarah, the woman he loved with a depth rarely seen between a husband and wife in any century, would unpin those notes carefully, one by one, keeping them in order when he arrived home. That small domestic detail says a great deal about the kind of marriage Johnathan and Sarah built. It was a partnership of minds and souls, a mutual devotion that every visitor to their home remarked upon. Johnathan first saw Sarah Pierpont when he was 20 and she was 13. He was so struck by her that he wrote about her in his journal, describing this young girl as someone beloved of the great being who made the world, someone who walked as if she could sing with the angels. He noted that she loved to be alone, walking through the fields as he loved to walk, communing with some great invisible presence. They were married on July 20, 1727. Johnathan was 24. Sarah was 17. She wore a bright green satin brocade dress, a vivid, joyful expression of love in a culture that has been so often misrepresented as cold and joyless. 11 children would be born to them. All 11 lived into adulthood, an extraordinary fact in an era when child mortality was devastating. George Whitefield, the great English revivalist, visited their home and said simply, "A sweeter couple I have not seen." He prayed God would give him such a companion. Samuel Hopkins, a young apprentice preacher who spent time in the Edwards household, said that no discerning person could spend time in that home without being struck by the perfect harmony and mutual love and esteem between Johnathan and Sarah. Every evening, Johnathan spent an hour talking with his children before returning to his study. He read his daily writings aloud to Sarah each night, listened to her response, and then they prayed together. His intellectual giant of a mind genuinely valued the wisdom of his wife. But the pastoral road ahead of Johnathan Edwards would not be gentle. His first call came in New York, where he served a small, struggling congregation that could not pay him adequately. He returned to Connecticut, reluctantly accepted a brief pastorate at Bolton, and was then offered a teaching position at Yale, a position he took partly, he confessed in his journals, because of the young Sarah Pierpont who lived nearby. But the reality of the job was brutal. The young men preparing for ministry at Yale had abandoned their strict upbringings at the first taste of freedom and replaced it with drinking, rowdiness, and disorder. Johnathan had been given the task of disciplining them, a responsibility he did not feel suited for. The stress wore him down. He became depressed. He was eventually bedridden for 4 months, and prolonged illness would shadow him for nearly every year that followed. Relief came when his grandfather, the towering Reverend Solomon Stoddard, so influential in New England that many called him the Pope of the Connecticut River Valley, invited Johnathan to Northampton, Massachusetts, to serve as his assistant. This was the largest church in New England outside Boston, and Stoddard, now in his 80s, needed help. Johnathan served faithfully under his grandfather even when he privately disagreed with certain policies, particularly Stoddard's tradition of allowing anyone who professed belief and lived without open scandal to join the church and take communion, without requiring evidence of genuine conversion. Johnathan believed that church membership demanded a real encounter with the living God. He quietly deferred to Stoddard while under his authority. It was a restraint that cost him, stored up in him, and would eventually define the conflict that altered the course of his life. When Solomon Stoddard died in February 1729, the congregation appointed Johnathan as senior pastor. He was 26 years old. He inherited a church of more than 1,000 people, a congregation that, in the years after the old patriarch's death, seemed to collectively exhale and lean towards sin. The young people in particular were a source of anguish to Johnathan. Drunkenness was common among them. Premarital pregnancies had risen to nearly 1 in 10 in New England. Parents had swung from strict discipline to almost total permissiveness, allowing sons and daughters to climb into bed together partially clothed in a practice called bundling, supposedly to help them become acquainted. As long as a resulting pregnancy ended in marriage, the community shrugged. Johnathan was not a man who could shrug. He preached. He prayed. He spent long hours on his knees. He met with families. He confronted sin plainly but always from a heart that genuinely ached for the people. Meanwhile, another grief pressed upon him personally. In December 1729, an epidemic of diphtheria swept through the region and took his youngest sister, Jerusha. Death was never distant. Then, without warning, the ground beneath Northampton shifted. On a night in 1727, all of New England had been shaken by the Great Earthquake, a terrifying, hours-long rumbling that sent people streaming into the streets in the dark, certain that Judgment Day had come. Churches across the colonies had filled with penitence in its aftermath. Johnathan had preached into that atmosphere of fear with unusual grace, pointing the people not to an angry God only but to the mercy of God who had warned Nineveh and waited for repentance. Some scholars mark the earthquake as the first tremor of what was coming. The deeper shaking began in Northampton in the early 1730s. Cultural forces were quietly at work. The ongoing conflicts with the French and Indians were pushing communities closer together, limiting the available land for young men to strike out on their own. Marriage was being postponed. Young people were remaining longer under their parents' authority. Johnathan sensed a new openness. He brought the parents together and called them to establish godly order in their own homes. He preached with an intensity and compassion that began to crack something in the atmosphere. Then, in April 1734, a young man died suddenly. Johnathan stood at the funeral and preached from the 90th Psalm, not from a text of judgment, but from a text about the brevity of life and the protection of God. He spoke plainly. If one could die so young, what would he have to show for his years? What would those gathered around your deathbed think, looking at the life you had spent in vanity and careless pleasure? The words landed differently than anyone expected. Within days, young people began appearing at the door of the Edwards home with stories of their hearts breaking open. Johnathan questioned each one carefully, with the painstaking rigor of a man who had seen counterfeit religion his entire life. But what he found in these young people was real. Their faces were different. Their behavior was different. Their concerns had completely redirected from the affairs of the world to the affairs of eternity. And then it spread. By the spring of 1735, something had happened to Northampton that could not be explained in ordinary terms. Johnathan himself described it in language that makes the reader catch their breath. He wrote that a great and earnest concern about religion and the eternal world had become universal in all parts of the town, among persons of all ages. All other conversation had simply stopped. Neighbors who had barely spoken to one another were taking up collections for families struck by disaster. The backbiting, the gossip, the bitter party rivalries that had poisoned the town, they ceased. Taverns emptied. Evening meetings of prayer replaced the evening frolics of just weeks before. And the Sunday assemblies, Johnathan described them as beautiful. The congregation was alive in God's service. Every hearer was drinking in the words of the minister as they came from his mouth. People wept in the pews, some with sorrow, some with joy, some with a deep and trembling concern for the souls of their neighbors. One of the most remarkable conversions of the revival was a young woman known throughout Northampton as one of the greatest company keepers in the whole town, a reputation that, in colonial Puritan society, was about as disreputable as it got. She came to Johnathan with her story of conversion. He questioned her with his characteristic thoroughness. He was not a man given to credulity, but what he saw and heard from her was real. Her entire life had changed. He worried that the improbability of her conversion might cause people to doubt its authenticity. Instead, he told her story publicly, and within days, a flood of others arrived at his door. By April 1735, reports were coming in from surrounding towns and settlements throughout the Connecticut River Valley, all the way to the coastal regions. Something was spreading, something that no preacher had organized, no committee had planned, no human strategy had manufactured. Illness reportedly nearly disappeared from Northampton during this season. Johnathan acknowledged it carefully in his later writings, neither overstating it nor dismissing it. He was too honest a man for either. He sat down and wrote a detailed account of everything he had witnessed and sent it to the minister Benjamin Coleman in Boston. Coleman forwarded it to England, where it eventually reached George Whitefield and John Wesley. That account was published under the title A Faithful Narrative of the Surprising Work of God and made Johnathan Edwards known throughout the English-speaking world. It was essentially a how-to manual for revival, written by a man who had watched God do in a single season what 1,000 well-crafted sermons alone could never accomplish. All Johnathan could do was point at it and say, "God did this. Not I." But just as the fire was burning, a shadow fell. Johnathan wrote simply that Satan seemed to be more let loose, and raged in a dreadful manner. A spirit of fear descended on several people who could not sleep, tormented by the sense of God's anger. Reports of an eerie invasion of crows darkening the skies above the town circulated widely. An epidemic swept through the valley, 99 dead in one town alone, 81 of them children. And then Jonathan's own family was struck. His uncle Joseph Hawley, a respected man in the town, was found with his own throat slit. Johnathan had already sealed his letter to Coleman but broke it open, unwilling to hide the darkness along with the light. He added the account honestly. His uncle, he explained, had been mentally unstable. He would not pretend the revival had been without shadow. He never pretended. His own health collapsed, and he was forced away for an extended rest. The first tremor of the Great Awakening in Northampton quieted during the summer of 1735. The dry years that followed were almost physically painful for Johnathan to endure. By March 1737, he wrote that his congregation had returned to an eagerness after the possessions of this life and to the heated party spirit he had known before the revival. He prayed for a fresh visitation of God. He spent as many as 18 hours in prayer before a single sermon. 18 hours. Not as a performance. Not as a spiritual exercise to impress anyone. As a desperate act of a man who knew that no amount of human preparation could substitute for the presence of God. A dramatic sign interrupted the coldness. The old meeting house had been deteriorating for some time, and the harsh winter had badly weakened its supports. In the middle of a packed Sunday sermon, the balcony split from its supports and crashed down upon the people below, mostly women and children. There was screaming. People scrambled through the debris, expecting to find bodies. When they finally cleared the rubble, they found no one dead. Not one. People had cuts, bruises, shaken nerves, but no bones were broken. Not a single life had been lost in what should have been a catastrophic structural collapse. Johnathan called it one of the most amazing instances of divine preservation that perhaps had ever been known in the land. He hoped it would break the people's hearts wide open. It did not. He wrote to Coleman with transparent grief that whereas 2 or 3 years earlier, 10 times less significant things had stirred his congregation deeply, this miracle of preservation had produced almost no lasting spiritual effect. His people were grateful for the mercy. But grateful was not the same as awakened. He pressed on. He kept preaching. He kept praying. And then, from across the Atlantic Ocean, an answer came. George Whitefield was 25 years old, and he was already preaching to crowds of thousands in the fields and streets of England. The newspapers called him the Grand Itinerant. His voice was said to carry so clearly outdoors that even Benjamin Franklin, who stood at the back of a crowd of thousands and paced away from Whitefield with measured steps to calculate the reach of his voice, was astonished at its power. Whitefield was theatrical, expressive, dramatic, everything Johnathan Edwards was not. He wept in the pulpit. He acted out the scriptures. He left the pulpit and walked among the people. Critics despised him. Crowds adored him. More importantly, God was using him in ways that set the whole of England trembling. Johnathan wrote to Whitefield in February 1740, urging him to come to Northampton. He warned him honestly that his people might be harder of heart than others to whom Whitefield had preached. On October 17, 1740, Whitefield came. He stood before Johnathan's congregation and reminded them of how close they had once been to Christ during the revival of 5 years earlier. Something broke in the room. People began to weep. Johnathan himself wept, sitting in his own pulpit, listening to another man preach, tears running down his face as 5 years of prayer for revival were answered in a single service. He reported that some of his own children were brought to Christ that day. For the next 2 days, Johnathan rode with Whitefield through the region, watching the impact of his preaching on crowds that gathered from every direction. People fell under the power of the Holy Spirit, something Johnathan described with the word faintings. There were reports of men and women lying motionless for as long as 24 hours, insensible to the natural world around them, while what appeared to be powerful spiritual experiences unfolded within them. Johnathan documented everything with his characteristic precision. He did not sensationalize. He did not explain away. He simply recorded what he saw. The revival of 1740 and 1741 was greater in scope than the first. Johnathan himself wrote that he had participated in it less, except by prayer. Prayer had done more than all his preaching. The harvest was God's alone. And then came the morning that everything reached its singular, extraordinary crescendo. Johnathan had been invited to preach at Enfield, a town near the border of Massachusetts and Connecticut, on the morning of July 8, 1741. Revival had already reached the surrounding settlements but had not yet touched Enfield itself. Several other ministers had been preaching at ongoing revival meetings in the area. That morning, the decision was made for the others to rest while Johnathan preached. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a sermon he had preached weeks earlier to his own congregation in Northampton. That congregation had sat unmoved. A few had offered polite compliments. Nothing more. The text was from the 32nd chapter of Deuteronomy, a single, chilling phrase, "Their foot shall slide in due time." The people who walked into the meeting house at Enfield that morning were not spiritually hungry. One minister who was present noted that they seemed more suited for a fashion show than a prayer meeting. They barely conducted themselves with common decency. They chatted. They fidgeted. Their posture radiated the boredom of people who had already decided nothing of consequence was going to happen. Johnathan Edwards stood before them, adjusted his thick spectacles, and began to read. His voice was not theatrical. His delivery was not dramatic. His gestures were almost non-existent. He stood still, reading steadily, and the words came out of his mouth with a terrible, measured clarity. He described the wrath of God as black clouds hanging over their heads, full of a dreadful storm. He described the sinner being held over the pit of hell the way a person holds a loathsome spider over a fire. He told them that nothing stood between them and hell in that very moment except the hand of a God whose patience was wearing thin and whose anger burned like a fire. He told them that God looked upon them and found them more abominable than the most hateful, venomous serpent was to human eyes. He told them they had no idea how close they were. But then he opened a door. He told them that Christ had flung the door of mercy wide open. That even now, on this very morning, in this very building, a day of extraordinary opportunity stood before them. That many who had been in the same condition just days before were now filled with love for the God who had washed them from their sins in his own blood, rejoicing in the hope of glory. He never finished. Before the words were out of his mouth, the sound had begun. It built from the outer edges of the room, pulling inward. Men grabbed the bench in front of them. People cried out. One minister wrote that the cries were specific, personal, anguished. "What shall I do to be saved? Oh, I am going to hell. Oh, what shall I do for Christ?" It was as if the floor had actually opened beneath them and they could feel the heat of what lay below. Another minister wrote that the assembly was bowed down under an awful conviction of sin and danger, and that the breathing of distress was so overwhelming that Johnathan had to stop and ask for silence so he could be heard. He could not be heard. The sermon was over. God had taken the room. Johnathan would write later of those months in the summer and autumn of 1741 that they were the most remarkable he had ever witnessed. Housefuls of outcries, faintings, and convulsions were frequent. Some in distress, others in what appeared to be overwhelming joy, wonder, and adoration. Some people were so overcome that they could not leave the building and remained through the night. Historians estimate that at least 10% of the entire population of colonial New England came to genuine faith during the years of the Great Awakening. That is tens of thousands of souls in a total population of only about 3 million. 150 new churches were established across the colonies. The spiritual landscape of what would soon become a nation was permanently altered, and the seeds of that transformation had been watered most faithfully by this one thin, bespectacled, perpetually ill Puritan pastor from Northampton. But the price Johnathan paid was steep. The revival itself created deep divisions. Those who had always preferred a tidy, rational, unemotional religion, they were called the Old Lights, looked at what was happening in the revival meetings with horror. The weeping, the falling, the physical manifestations, the crying out, they called it fanaticism. One critic, a reverend named Charles Chauncey, accused Whitefield and the revivalists of manufacturing hysteria. Some said Chauncey had himself tried to become a revival preacher and had failed, which may explain the particular bitterness of his opposition. Johnathan was uniquely placed to navigate this conflict. He could not simply dismiss the Old Lights, because he himself had wrestled deeply with the question of authentic versus counterfeit spiritual experience. He had spent a lifetime studying the difference between emotion that was of God and emotion that was merely human excess. He sat down and wrote a careful, rigorous analysis of the revival, acknowledging that some emotional excess had occurred but arguing powerfully that the fruit, changed lives, broken habits, renewed communities, genuine love expressed outwardly, was the true test of whether God had moved. A person must have more than feelings, he insisted. True conversion produces love, and love produces action. Christianity was not church on Sunday. It was an inside-out transformation that expressed itself in the way a person treated their neighbors on Monday morning. He was right. He was also deeply unpopular with those who did not want to hear it. The controversy over the revival was still simmering when Johnathan was confronted with the question of church membership and communion, the very question on which he had quietly disagreed with his grandfather for years. He finally declared that he would no longer continue the policy of admitting anyone to membership or the Lord's Supper without evidence of genuine conversion. He wanted a church that was actually converted. This was not a small theological footnote. In Northampton, where the Stoddard tradition ran deep and where many families had been receiving communion for 2 generations without anyone asking them about the state of their souls, it was an earthquake. A separate incident involving several young men in the church who obtained books on midwifery and used them to taunt young women in deeply inappropriate ways added another layer of conflict when Johnathan handled the disciplinary process in a way that the church leadership felt was mismanaged. The combination proved fatal. After 23 years as pastor, 23 years of prayer, preaching, revival, sorrow, illness, and unflinching faithfulness, Johnathan Edwards was voted out of his own pulpit in 1750. He was 46 years old with a large family to support and, for the moment, no income. A small band from the congregation urged him to start a rival church in the town. He refused. He would not be the cause of a deeper division. He bore the dismissal without bitterness. He was seen, in the weeks and months that followed, treating those who had voted against him with the same brotherly kindness he had always shown. One of the men who had led the campaign against him eventually wrote an extensive public apology, full of expressed shame. Johnathan showed no sign of relishing the vindication. 60 miles to the west, at the village of Stockbridge, there was a small mission to the Native American Mohican and Mahican people. The salary was modest. The position was far below what a man of Johnathan Edwards's reputation might have expected. He accepted it humbly and moved his family. At Stockbridge, something unexpected happened. The grief and the stripping, the loss of the pulpit, the financial insecurity, the quiet of the frontier, became a gift. Johnathan had more uninterrupted time for study and writing than he had enjoyed in years. He wrote in a tiny room next to the chimney of their house, working on sheets of paper he salvaged from the white edges of old newspapers and the blank spaces at the bottom of letters he had received, stitching them into notebooks because paper was scarce. In that small room, with almost nothing, he produced some of the most important theological writing in the history of the American church, works that scholars and theologians would still be reading and debating 300 years later. He also served the Native Americans with genuine love. He created worship services with the kind of spirit-filled singing and storytelling he had always wanted to bring to Northampton. He taught the Bible to children through stories. He and Sarah fed hundreds of people in the fort nearby when the French and Indian War brought refugees to their door. Johnathan Edwards, the man who had once pastored the largest congregation in New England, was now ladling out food to displaced Native Americans and French settlers in a frontier fort. And from every account that survives, he did it without complaint, without self-pity, and without any sign that he considered himself diminished. He also carried a father's grief during these years. His daughter Jerusha, a young woman of remarkable faith and beauty, had become deeply close to the missionary David Brainerd, a young man Johnathan had mentored after Brainerd had been expelled from Yale for his enthusiastic embrace of the revival. Brainerd had given himself entirely to reaching the Native Americans, traveling 3,000 miles on horseback through his own chronic illness. Johnathan had taken him in when his health failed, and Brainerd spent his last weeks in the Edwards home, with Jerusha caring for him day and night. He died in her arms. And then Jerusha contracted the tuberculosis that had consumed Brainerd and died just months later. Johnathan buried his daughter. Then he sat down and edited Brainerd's diary for publication. The Life and Diary of David Brainerd, introduced by Johnathan Edwards, has never gone out of print. It has sent hundreds of men and women to the mission field. Jim Elliot, who was martyred by the Auca Indians of South America in 1956, recorded in his diary just days before his death that reading Brainerd's journal had convicted him of pride. The ripple of one life, faithfully documented by one man who never stopped believing that God could use broken, sick, overlooked people to shake nations, has touched more lives than anyone can count. In September 1757, news arrived at Stockbridge that Johnathan's son-in-law, Aaron Burr, the president of the College of New Jersey, had died suddenly of malaria at the age of 41. The grief was enormous. And then the rest of the message arrived. Johnathan had been elected to take Burr's place as president of what would become Princeton University. He tried, like Moses before the burning bush, to argue against it. He was unwell. He was deficient in certain areas of learning required for the role. Above all, he felt swallowed up in his study and writing, and he desperately did not want to leave it. He wept before his advisors when they told him they believed it was his duty to accept. He agreed to go. He arrived in New Jersey in January 1758, with his daughter Lucy beside him. He was surprised, in his first weeks at the college, to find that he genuinely enjoyed preaching to the students and faculty. He had more time for study than he had feared. He began to hope that Princeton might be the next chapter of a fruitful life. Smallpox was raging through New England. Johnathan, always the careful thinker, had decided years earlier that if the situation required it, he would receive an inoculation, a procedure still deeply controversial in those days. He consulted the trustees of the college. They agreed. On February 13, 1758, Johnathan received the inoculation, as did his recently widowed daughter Esther. At first he showed only mild symptoms. Then, weeks later, a severe fever set in. It did not break. On March 22, 1758, Johnathan Edwards died at the age of 55. He died as he had lived, with clarity, with faith, and with the people he loved uppermost in his mind. In his final days, knowing the end was near, he asked his daughter Lucy to write down his words. He sent his love to Sarah, calling their marriage an uncommon union, a phrase that contained the weight of 30 years of devotion. He asked for a simple funeral and requested that any money designated for funeral expenses be given to the poor instead. And then, when those around his deathbed believed he had already slipped beyond hearing or speaking, Johnathan Edwards surprised them one last time. His eyes opened, and out of his mouth came the final words he ever spoke: "Trust in God, and ye need not fear." The attending physician noted that he passed into eternity with perfect freedom from pain. He fell asleep. He was buried on the grounds of Princeton. Less than 2 weeks later, Esther, his daughter, died, leaving behind 2 small children, including a 2-year-old boy named Aaron Burr Jr., who would grow up to become Vice President of the United States. That autumn, Sarah Edwards traveled from Stockbridge to Philadelphia to collect her grandchildren. She fell ill on the journey. On October 2, 1758, just 6 months after her husband's death, Sarah Edwards joined him in glory. She was 48 years old. They buried her beside him in the Princeton Cemetery. They had been married 31 years. 11 children. 100 years of legacy packed into a single lifetime. When historians looked back at the descendants of Johnathan and Sarah Edwards alone, what they found was staggering. By the year 1900, from that one family had come 13 college presidents, 65 professors, 100 lawyers including 1 dean of a law school, 30 judges, 66 physicians including 1 dean of a medical school, 135 editors, 1 publisher, more than 100 overseas missionaries, and 80 public office holders including 3 United States senators, the governors of 3 states, and 1 vice president of the United States. Among their descendants were also the writer O. Henry, the publisher Frank Nelson Doubleday, and one of America's first ladies. The generational fruit of 2 people who simply pursued God with all they had. What does the life of Johnathan Edwards say to the heart that is paying attention? It says that God does not call the comfortable. He calls the willing, and then he shows up in the willingness. Johnathan Edwards was never healthy. He was chronically ill from his 20s onward. He was not a dramatic speaker. He was not an organizational genius. He could not manage an unruly classroom of seminarians. He was fired from the church he had given 23 years of his life to. He buried a daughter. He watched revivals he had prayed and fasted for rise and fall and rise again, while critics mocked and colleagues divided and the spiritual temperature of a whole generation rose and fell like the weather. And through all of it, the illness, the loss, the dismissal, the grief, he never stopped pressing toward God. He never stopped writing. He never stopped preaching. He never stopped praying. He never stopped seeking. Swallowed up in God was not just a phrase he used once in a conversion journal. It was the orientation of his entire life. He wanted nothing else. He settled for nothing less. The great awakening that God wrought through him turned a set of scattered British colonies into something with a common spiritual identity. A people who had seen God move together, who had prayed together, who had wept together, who had been changed together. Johnathan Edwards lit the fire. He documented it honestly with all its shadows and excesses and glories. He defended it against those who wanted to extinguish it. He refused to be bitter when the institution he loved expelled him. He refused to be proud when the world recognized him. And in the end, with his last breath, he pointed not to his books or his revivals or his legacy or his descendants. He pointed to God. Trust in God, and ye need not fear. That was his whole message. It always had been. If the story of Johnathan Edwards has stirred something in your soul today, a hunger you had forgotten, a longing for the God who is not merely a doctrine but a presence, do not ignore that stirring. That is the Holy Spirit speaking to you, just as he spoke to the people of Northampton, just as he spoke to the crowd at Enfield on that July morning in 1741. The door of mercy is still wide open. It has not closed. If you have drifted from God, if the fire has gone cold, if you have been sitting in the church pew or standing in the far country and you know, deep in your bones, you know, that something is missing, this is your moment. Come back. He is not waiting for you with anger. He is waiting for you with the same heart he had when the prodigal son was still a long way off and the father saw him and ran. If this story has moved you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your share could be the thing that drops somebody into a story that changes their life. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of the men and women who gave everything to know God and to make Him known. These stories are not history lessons. They are burning coals from the altar of heaven, and they are meant to set you on fire. And before you go, tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from. We want to know. We are building something here together, and you are part of it. Trust in God, and ye need not fear.